Hey, this is Chris. Today we are going to continue our discussion of communion. Well, specifically, we're going to continue our discussion of the Passover Roots of Communion. We have previously gone through what God had to say in Exodus, and then we stopped in Leviticus 23 to see what more He might have to say. And today we are going to continue our journey through the Old Testament, stopping in Deuteronomy 16. To see what, if any, further regulations God has for the Israelites out to enter into the land that God promised them. Does God have any further regulations for Passover? And it turns out He does. If we look in Deuteronomy 16:5, He says, "You may not sacrifice the Passover in just any of your villages that the Lord your God is giving you, but you must sacrifice it in the evening in the place where He chooses to locate His name, at sunset, the time of the day you came out of Egypt. You must cook and eat it in the place the Lord your God chooses. You may return the next morning to your tents." If we just think about the context, think about what's going on here. The Israelites have been traveling as one group of people for 40 years as they've wandered in the desert. And so each one of those 40 years they celebrated the Passover according to the regulation handed down in Exodus. I think, the most important thing to think about when we think about how they celebrated Passover in the desert for those 40 years, that they did so, it was an individual thing to do. Either a family or multiple families would come together to sacrifice a lamb. But it was also a very corporate thing where all of the people of Israel, they were all together out in the desert, and they all were required to kill the lamb at the same time. And so it had a very corporate identity to it. And so as they enter into this new promised land, we know what's going to happen is each of the tribes is going to get their own section of land. And so therefore, the nation of Israel will not be together in one corporate unit anymore. And so what God is really saying here, He's saying He is not willing to forego the corporate nature of the Passover. In other words, what He wants, He's perfectly willing to give the Israelites, each tribe of the Israelites, their own section of land. But for this festival, He expects His people to gather together as one group in order to perform that sacrifice and eat that meal and remember what God did for them as He led them out of Egypt. And so at first glance we might think that this is a new regulation and it really changes the nature of Passover, but really, as we've just gone through that explanation, we see it does not change the character of Passover. It actually maintains it. Israel was still expected to be a chosen people, and that chosen people was expected to gather together, would be the tent of meeting. Remember, the tent of meeting had been the center of Israelite life through the entire 40 years in the wilderness, and so it would have continued to be so until the time of the founding of the temple, which did not happen until much later under King David. Well, King David wanted to do it, and then Solomon actually did it, but that was several hundred years into the future. So the tent of meeting evidently was taken into the promised land and set up at Shiloh, and so reasonable inference is that that's where it stayed, and that would have been the place where God would have expected the Israelites to come and celebrate Passover once a year until the temple was established. And then of course it would have been in Jerusalem at the temple. And of course that brings us into Jesus' time, doesn't it? He and his family regularly went up to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And so we see that the regulation that seemed to added and changed the character of the Passover, we see actually maintained the character of the Passover and kept the Israelites together as a cohesive people for that celebration and remembrance of what God had done for them. And so just one more link in the chain from Passover to communion. Hope you like these videos. Hope you've learned something from it. I know I have. I actually had to look up where the where the tent of meeting ended up after the Israelites entered into the Promised Land, because I had forgotten exactly where that was. And so, anyway, until our next video, God bless you.